I get asked quite often, what is the most important project that you've worked on? And a lot of people assume it's the Bugatti Aerolift project. And while that was fun and important, it isn't the most important car that we've done. The most important car, in my opinion, was the Alfa Romeo 6C 2500 Speciale by Pininfarina. And here's a photograph of it. What was important about this car? Well, there's a lot of different things. Without this car, there's an awful lot of Ferraris that wouldn't exist. Sadly, we don't have the car itself. It's now in a collection in Germany. Rather than recovering old territory, I've already done a video on this. We're going to include that video in here, but I'm going to pop up during the video with some comments on that I didn't make originally. I hope you enjoy. Every now and then, something very special has come into the shop. And, it's fairly infrequent. I mean, a lot of people think everything we do is special, but, after your 16th or 17th 57 Chevy, you start thinking, well, as nice as they are, here's another one. But on occasion, something special happens. And, this happened to me a few years ago when an acquaintance of ours phoned me up and said, listen, we have some cars for sale in Japan. There's an old Alfa there, or a couple of them, and would you be interested? So I thought, well, I wouldn't personally be interested in them, but I may have some clients. So I phoned around, and one of my clients said, yes, indeed, he was interested in the Alfas, get some information on them and everything. So we did, and then, he paid sort of a nominal sum, and they started on their trek from Japan. As we pulled open the container, my thoughts when I looked in, because there was a pile of aluminum rubble. Literally, there was nothing left of this car. And we had bought it because there was two Alfas, and there was one called a Freccia d'Oro, which is golden arrow in Italian. And it was a coupe, and it was a nice car, and I thought, well, between the two of them, we've got this much in parts. When that container opened, I thought, oh my God, we don't have anywhere near the value in parts. Honest to God, I thought my client, Chris, well, he might just kill me. So we pulled it out, and the car was just miserable, the primary car. The other one wasn't too bad. It was moldy and everything, but it was complete. But restored, it was worth about the same as the entire sum paid. When Chris first saw the Freccia d'Oro, he thought, this might be a great project to resto mod. And I agreed with him. It would be fun. But then he thought, well, the Alfa Romeo community might lynch him. So I was a little disappointed. And then we started to look into this Roadster, and it had been attributed to a coach builder in Italy post-war, and and that was all very interesting. But as I researched it, I found it wasn't an unknown coach builder built it. It was Pininfarina. So we started looking into it, and then we discovered something very, very important. And that was, in 1945 and 1946, the French weren't very happy with the Italians for obvious reasons. They had the Paris Salon in 1946, and they weren't going to allow any German cars or Italian cars or Japanese cars into the Salon, which is understandable. Battista Farina, who had a company called Pininfarina, had his company going since before the war, but the war had sort of gutted the entire industry, and coach building was on its way out because of American mass marketing and mass production. He had conceptualized a car during the war. He had a client, Madame Tortoli, who was a perfumier in Milan. She wanted him to build her a special car. So he set about building it. He used a military chassis that had been sent. They wanted like a staff car built on it or something. It had been sent to him in 1941 or 1942. He had it in the shop. He started building this dramatic car, sort of all the ideas he had during the war when he was so constrained and couldn't build neat stuff. In 1945, 1946, he got it finished, and he delivered it, and it went to some concours events, which were more fashion shows than car shows in those days. But it did very well. And when he got it back into his shop, he asked Madame Tortoli if it'd be all right if he drove the car to Paris to put it in the Paris Salon. And she was fine with that. So he got his son together with a couple of journalists, and they took two cars, the 6C 2500 Alfa and a Lancia. Amazingly enough, the owner of that Lancia contacted me with the idea that putting the Alfa and the Lancia together at another show would be great. And it would have been great had it happened. And they drove them from Turin all the way to Paris, which was quite a trek in cars that were fairly slow, and especially the roads in those days, there were no super highways. What made their life even more difficult on the journey was all the tunnels and bridges connecting Italy to France had been destroyed during the war.
So they had to really take a long route to get from northern Italy to Paris.
So it was a long and arduous trek. When they got to Paris, he presented very proudly this really dramatic car to the authorities, who said, "You're not coming in." They just absolutely disallowed him to come into the Paris salon. So he and his son retired to a friend's place, and they thought, well, what the hell are we going to do? And they decided that they were going to drive the car to the Grand Palais and park it out right in front of the venue, right at the base of the stairs up to the front doors. And they were going to do that in the dark, first thing in the morning. So they spent the night cleaning the car, got it ready, along with the Lancia, and they drove them and they parked them in front of the Grand Palais, and they did that every single morning of the show. The show's promoters were absolutely livid. I mean, they were furious with him. They basically said, that devil Batista. But the media loved him, and every person who went to the Paris Salon that year had to walk by the car in order to get in. And people loved it. The media just couldn't stop talking about it. They called it Batista Pinin's Petit Salon.
It's hard for us to understand now just how radically different this car was in 1946. I mean, to us, it looks pretty mundane, but in 1946, it didn't look like anything else out there.
And the car was a hit, so much so that the organizers of the Paris Salon finally gave up and said, you know what, next year, you're going to be right in the middle. They basically awarded him a spot right in the middle of the Paris Salon, and that made his name as a coach builder. You know, without this specific car, there would have been no Pininfarina. And if there's no Pininfarina, that means probably 90% of the Ferraris designed since the 40s wouldn't exist, because Pininfarina designed cars for General Motors, for Ford, for almost every car manufacturers have Pinin designed cars. So this one car established Pininfarina as a major coach builder that survived the war. Most of the others didn't. If that is all the car had done, that would be quite enough, wouldn't it? But it did more than that. It was sold off not too long after that. It was bought by the managing director of Austin in England. And he loved the car, and he drove it personally. But more importantly, he used the car as a design mule for the Austin A90 Atlantic, which was being built at that time to try to capture some of the American market.
After the war, Europe was ravaged. There wasn't a single large city that basically remained intact. So they had other things on their mind rather than buying cars. But America, well, that was different. There was no damage, plus they had a huge industry that had been built up over the last 5 years, and they had all kinds of money. So the American nuclear family was born, and they wanted cars.
There was no European market for cars in those days. They were, as I said, they were in rubble, but the Americans had lots of money, and they were thriving. So Austin went, well, we got to sell cars in the United States. They needed a car that was sort of typed to what Americans would want to drive. To that end, they hired a gentleman by the name of Mr. Cotto, and Holden Cotto. He worked with Raymond Loewy, who was famous for designing Studebakers and some very, very interesting cars. And he went to England, was attached to Austin. He was working with them. He fell in love with the car. They had finished sort of using it as a design mule by that time, and he bought it for £1,000. And that was almost a gift, because at the time it was still worth £6,000 or £7,000. Think about that in the late 1940s. It's a lot of money. He took it back to the United States. While it was in shipment, it was being lifted off the ship down, and the car was quite badly damaged front and back by ropes and chains, and the car went directly from the docks to Raymond Loewy's garage. And Raymond Loewy and Holden Cotto worked on this car personally to fix it. He ended up painting it green instead of the bronze it had been. And then it began a life in America. Mercedes later on claimed that they had the splash guards, which are over the wheel arches, front and back, on the 300 Mercedes SLs, you know, literally the gull wings and the roadsters. This car had those 10 years before. So, I mean, it was new to this car. It certainly was probably seen by Mercedes designers, and they went, oh, that's a good idea. Another car this inspired was the Austin Healey. And if you look at this car, it is basically looks like a giant Austin Healey from the side. So, you know, very, very significant car. Sometime during its travels in the States and changing hands, it became lost. It ended up engineless in a shop in California that went out of business. It was called Hill and Vaughn, and Phil Hill, the famous racing car driver, was one of the partners. They weren't doing so well. They closed the shop. The contents were sold, and a gentleman by the name of Tamagawa in Japan bought all the contents of Hill and Vaughn and had them shipped. And this car, as a wreck, went to Japan. Tamagawa had quite a few cars, and he had some projects that he was really enjoying doing.
I spent a fair amount of time with Tamagawa at Pebble Beach, and there's more than one occasion where I helped pour him into the minivan to get him back to his hotel after an evening of, maybe partying a bit too much.
This wasn't on the list. When I saw photographs of it, it was parked in the corner of a large garage, basically in a pile with all whatever parts it had piled on top of it, with the Frecciadoro right next to it. It was just a mess. So we bought it. And the rest is basically history. I mean, we did a very extensive restoration. The chap who purchased it and had us restoring it for him insisted that we keep as much of the original coachwork as possible. Now, this is an all-aluminum car, and it was put together by people who are really inexpert. I don't think that there was a lot of old coach builders around in 1946 in Italy. So you can see there was a lot of just very, very poor quality work. And the quality of the aluminum itself is very bad. And I have joked about it, but I actually think it's true that probably the aluminum in this car was recovered from the drop tanks from American fighters and bombers. The Americans used to rain these huge aluminum drop tanks everywhere they went. As soon as they ran out of fuel or went into combat, the aircraft would release the drop tank and it would just fall to the earth. And the Axis powers used to recover them and reuse the aluminum. Very likely, most of this car was hanging under a P-51 or a P-38 at some time in its life. The trouble with that was it was very poor quality aluminum, and we had a lot of corrosion, a lot of time damage and everything to deal with, and the constraint of having to use as much as was possible to use. So it took the restoration to completely new realms, because we had to find ways of preserving this old rotted aluminum and a lot of the components. And one of the things that we wanted to do was preserve the historical integrity of the car. It's one thing to restore a car and replace everything and make it all shiny and new, but sometimes you want people to be able to see how the original car was built. This car had very poor welding, for instance. It was all spattered and had virtually no strength. Somebody who was very inexpert at welding had put it together. I wanted to make sure that people knew that was the original welding, and it wasn't the welding we did either. So what I would do is we would take our modern style flowed welding and we would run it along and just up and over some of the old welds. So always leaving an index of something very old and not particularly good underneath or next to something that was new. So once we got the car finished, it went to Pebble Beach. Didn't do very well there. And I think, the judges, they liked the car, but I don't think they understood it. I mean, they didn't spend a lot of time because they don't have a lot of time. But, one of them made the comment that, oh my God, that dashboard's awful. That can't possibly be original. And yet it's one of the most stunningly beautiful dashboards they've ever seen. But he said there's too much chrome, it would be too shiny. Well, only if the sun is shining off the floorboards. But the other thing in that, we had photographs taken in 1946 and 47 of parts of this dashboard. We didn't change anything. Madame Tortoli had designed a lot of this car herself, or had influenced the design. And that was the dashboard. We had enough of the original to absolutely determine what it was like. The steering wheel was a real problem for us because it didn't exist. It wasn't on the car, and we didn't have any clear photographs. Every photograph we had, there was somebody sitting in the car, so they were eclipsing most of the wheel. It took 2 years. We finally found a photograph of this car where we could see 3/4 of the wheel. Then we spent another year looking for one. Turned out this wheel was called anti-seismic because there was a rubber ring to stop vibration reaching your hands. It didn't exist. There were other ones that were similar, but we couldn't do similar. We had to do exact. So the guys here, Kalev on staff and Thomas and that, carved this wheel and hand-stitched the leather onto it, even created the logos and everything that are in the new site. So, a magnificent job. Then Kalev, we couldn't get a radio, so Kalev made the radio. That was very clever of him. The next major show we took it out to was the Concours at Villa d'Este, Lake Como in Italy. There's only 50 cars a year invited to this, and it, in my opinion, is probably the most important and influential concours in the world. Putting Pebble aside, this one's the oldest, and it is really very special. We took this car there, and the moment it appeared, the Italians went nuts. As a matter of fact, the people from Pinin Farina didn't know the car still existed, knew all about the car, but had no idea where it had gone. So they were just over the moon about the fact that here it is. The members of the family that found Alfa Romeo, there was quite a few of them there, they went nuts over the car. Despite what a couple of the judges in Pebble Beach said about the interior, it won Most Elegant Interior at Lake Como, which is a very significant award.
Something that a lot of people don't know, that after the Concours in Italy, the car went on to Concours in Germany, the Concours d'Elegance at Essen, and it won Best in Show. A couple hours later, an offer came in from a German collector. His offer was a world record price for a 6C 2500. Chris, smartly accepted it, and it was gone. After Villa d'Este, during Villa d'Este, Paolo Pininfarina, the guy who runs Pininfarina, saw the car. He asked if I would be willing to loan the car to them for 3 or 4 weeks so they could examine it, and then invited me to attend their 85th anniversary, where I would lead a parade of 300 Pininfarina designed cars through the streets of Turin to the palace for lunch. Well, how can you turn that kind of an offer down?
We were beyond pleased. Since that time, it has done very well for itself. It's also been exhibited, to me, more importantly, in art museums. For what it is a magnificent art piece. And unlike many of these, cars that are sort of more art than competent cars, driving this car is a joy. I mean, it drives beautifully. I won't say like a modern car, but certainly not like just about all the other cars. So as far as a masterful piece of design, the blending of a beautiful driveline with an exquisite body, I don't think you can get any better than this car. In my opinion, and I think the opinion of quite a few other people, this is probably one of the most important cars post-war that's still in existence. I mean, you see lots of prototypes and everything, but there's not too many cars built by a coach builder that have had an influence on so many other cars. The fact that it looks 1960s or 1970s contemporary is a tribute to how far in advance it was that he prophesied and influenced cars that would come later.
Sadly, the Alfa is long gone, and while I sort of miss it, there's always new projects at the Guild, and we'll be covering those off in the weeks and years to come. Stay tuned, there's going to be a lot more fun to be had.